Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically to talk about Rosneft, which is the biggest company in Russia. This is the giant oil and gas producer. It produces some gas. It's mostly known for its oil, but when you have an oil field, quite often you'll find gas there as well. And around about 25% of Rosneft's income does come from gas, although it's not allowed to officially export any of that gas. The only company that can export Russian gas is Gazprom, and obviously Gazprom is in a world of pain ever since Europe turned its back on Russian gas and stopped buying it. But the reason why I wanted to talk about Rosneft is that they've just released their results for the 9 months through to September 2025, and these results are disastrous. Income is down by 17.8%, but more importantly, net income, so the profitability of the company, is down by 70%. So that tells us that Rosneft is struggling right now. And this is before the impact of the direct sanctions that were applied against the company on the 22nd of October, because these results only go through to September. So if we quickly have a look at the ownership structure of Rosneft, because it isn't actually 100% owned by the Russian state. The Russian state only owns around 45%. BP previously owned 19.75%, but at the start of the war, BP cancelled all of its business in Russia, and that stake is now officially frozen. The Qatar Investment Authority owns 18.93%, and around 12% is floated freely in the market, so you can buy shares in Rosneft. So the Russian state actually has a minority position. It doesn't have a majority. It's not over 50%. However, it does have the majority voting power. So there's a difference between the number of shares issued and the number of voting shares. So basically, Russia gets to decide what happens with Rosneft. And so the government has appointed its own management team. It has strategic influence, and there's a lot of political directives that are fed through into the company. So essentially, this is a state-owned enterprise, even though officially some of the people are actually on the shareholder register. Now, before we go on any further today, could I ask anybody that hasn't subscribed yet to please hit that subscriber button? It doesn't cost you anything. It's not a real subscription, but it does help me with the algorithm and also helps to put a smile on my face. Now, if we have a look at this chart, it shows Rosneft's revenue in US dollar equivalents. What I've done here is converted the amount of revenue from Russian rubles using the average exchange rate for each of these individual years. And this dates back to 2019. The reason I've gone back that far is I wanted to show the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see that in 2019, the company made 129 billion US dollars of revenue. That fell to just under 80 billion in 2020 as a result of the pandemic, because there was a general reduction in demand for oil because we were all sitting at home watching Netflix and not being able to use our cars. So there was a huge drop in domestic demand, but also there was a drop in commercial demand as well because most companies had to close down. In 2021, things started to recover, and the company delivered just under $120 billion worth of revenue, which is less than 2019. So there was still an impact from the pandemic. Now, 2022 was the year when Russia invaded Ukraine in February. And you can see that that actually represented a record-breaking year, as you'll know if you follow the channel. Despite the fact that Russia was faced with some sanctions, we saw oil prices going up to really high levels. So all oil producing companies and countries benefited from that, because if you can sell your product for a higher price, then you're going to make more profit and more revenue. And so Rosneft saw its revenue soar to $147 billion. Now, since that time, we've seen it coming back down. In 2023, it dropped down to 117 billion, which was less than both 2019 and 2021. So there was some impact of the sanctions because we had the price cap that was applied against Russian oil, and it was more difficult for Russian businesses to actually do trade because of those sanctions, and European buyers didn't want to buy Russian oil. So Rosneft had to start selling a lot more into India and China, but it was still making a lot of revenue. That revenue declined slightly in 2024 to 109 billion, but still pretty healthy and still significantly above 2020. However, in the first 9 months of 2025, we've seen the figure dropping to $70 billion. Now, obviously, that's only 9 months, so it's 3/4 of a year. However, as I said at the start of today's video, these figures are actually before the direct sanctions that were applied against Rosneft kicked in. And also, there's a big problem with regards to net income and cash flow that Rosneft is suffering right now. Now, if you followed the channel, you'll know that I'd like to keep things simple so that we can all understand what's going on. And there's a term in the world of finance called EBITDA or EBITDA or EBITDA, whichever way you want to pronounce it. And this basically stands for earnings before interest, tax, depreciation, and amortization. And the reason why EBITDA or EBITDA is used quite a lot is because it tells us how much a company actually is producing in terms of profitability. Because what it does is it strips out things like interest, tax, and depreciation on your assets to show that in normal circumstances, this is how much profit you would be making. So I thought it was worth having a look at what Rosneft's EBITDA has been over the same period. So you can see that it's significantly less than the revenue figure. And the reason for that is obviously that Rosneft has a lot of costs. Producing oil is a high fixed cost business because you have to set up drilling operations and then you have to have lots of people and all the machinery, and it's really expensive to do that. And so you then have to pay for all of those costs. So just because you're selling oil for maybe $80 per barrel doesn't mean you're making $80 profit, because you've got to pay all your own costs and then you've got to pay all of the shipping costs and all of those sorts of things. So if we have a quick look at this chart, you can see that in 2019, Rosneft produced EBITDA of 32.5 billion. That fell to 22 billion in 2020, bounced back up to 31.9 billion. So you can see that despite there was a big increase in 2021 revenue, there wasn't a big increase in profitability compared with 2019. It was less. It fell further in 2022, despite 2022 being a record-breaking year. In terms of revenue, it wasn't a record-breaking year in terms of EBITDA because Russia was having to send lots of its oil much further to places like China and India rather than sending the oil through pipelines to Europe. So it was more expensive to actually deliver that oil. And it was also having to do things like use the shadow fleet and trying to avoid the sanctions on the whole, which is more costly. In 2023, interestingly, profitability rose to a record-breaking level, and that was the year when Russia basically managed to get round all of the sanctions. India was buying huge volumes of oil, so the profitability started to come back. It fell back down to 32.6, which was still above where it had been in 2019, so 2024 was a good year. However, in 2025, in the first 9 months, it has crashed to 18.2. So this tells us that although revenue is doing okay, profitability is starting to suffer. But EBITDA isn't actual profitability because it's before interest, which Rosneft has to pay on all of its debt. And as you'll know, if you've been following the channel, interest costs have risen significantly since the start of the war in Ukraine. At one point, we had 21% interest rates in Russia, which means that companies like Rosneft would have been paying 23 or 24% on all its borrowings. It's before tax, and taxes have gone up in Russia. And as a state-owned enterprise, Rosneft will be paying large amounts of tax. They'll have to pay tax on all of this profitability. And it's before depreciation and amortization. And depreciation and amortization is basically a way of spreading the cost of buying things. So if you set up a new oil drilling facility, and let's say it costs $100 billion to build it, just as an example, no, that's a big number. But if it was 100 billion, if you were just writing it through your accounts, if you were just basically taking that hit, you would make a massive loss in that year. So if you had to pass 100 billion through your accounts in any one year, obviously it would wipe out all of these profits that you can see on the screen. However, rather than doing that, the way you account for it is you look at how long that asset is going to last. So let's assume that it was going to last for 20 years, your new oil drilling facility. So rather than taking 100 billion hit in 1 year, you would spread it over 20 years because it will last for 20 years. So you would only account for 5 billion every year. So if you were passing 5 billion through these accounts, then you could afford to do that because Rosneft was making 20 or 30 billion profit. So that's what depreciation and amortization is. It spreads out the cost of big expenditure over the life of whatever you're building or whatever you're buying. And so it gives you a better average view of profitability. But the problem that Rosneft has is that it has to pay interest and tax, and it will also have to pay for all of this equipment to be replaced. So net income is actually quite important, but cash flow is king. You may have heard that phrase before, cash is king. And the reason why cash is king is because if you're a business, you need cash to pay for everything that you need to do. So this chart shows us Rosneft's free cash flow over the period between 2019 to 2025. So now we're starting to get into the detail as to how much money Rosneft has at the end of each year. So in 2019, it had quite a lot of free cash flow, $13.6 billion. That number fell to 3.3 during the pandemic, despite the fact that revenue was still quite high, because it still had to pay for a lot of its costs. It's a fixed cost business. You still had all of the oil rigs. It needed to maintain all of its facilities to make sure that they would be ready to go again once demand started rising. So there were a lot of costs in 2020. In 2021, revenue started to come back, so free cash flow rose to 14.1 billion. It rose further to 17.5 billion in 2022, rose to a peak of 18.2 in 2023, then came back down to 13.9, which was similar to where it'd been in 2021 and 2019. But in 2025, we've seen free cash flow crashing to 6.6 billion. But free cash flow isn't the only problem that Rosneft has. Net income is the actual profitability of the business after all of these costs. And this is the chart for Rosneft's net income dating back to 2019. So back in that year, it was 10.9 billion. In 2020, during the pandemic, after paying for all of those different things, interest, tax, depreciation, all of that, it actually fell into a loss of 1.6 billion. We saw profitability bounce back in 21 to 12 billion, dropped back to 10.1 in 22, rose to 14.1 in 23. 24, we saw it come back to 11.7. And so far, in the first 9 months of 2025, Rosneft has only made profit of $3.57 billion. But as I've said, this is before the impact of the real direct sanctions that have been applied against Rosneft on the 22nd of October 2025. So Rosneft currently is facing a big problem for the last quarter. And Reuters recently reported that it's expecting Russian revenue from oil and gas to fall by 35% in November alone. So that tells us that there are serious problems, and it's extremely likely that Rosneft is going to fall into another loss-making year in 2025, and 2026 looks seriously worse. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we've been talking a lot about Lukoil, which is the second largest oil producer in Russia, and recently lost all of its overseas assets. It was the one that was trying to become a global player by buying lots of overseas entities. But Rosneft is the single biggest oil producer in Russia. It's the biggest company. So it's really important not just to the oil industry, but also to the Russian economy, because it contributes lots of tax and also employs lots of people. So it's a really big player. And what we've seen in today's video is that in the first 9 months of 2025, Rosneft's figures have started to collapse. It's seen a fall of almost 20% in revenue and a drop of 70% in profitability. So that tells us that there are serious issues. And this was only in the first 9 months of the year before the sanctions were applied directly against the company. That has been a dagger blow to the heart of Rosneft. Since the war in Ukraine started, this company has actually performed quite well, because even though there were lots of sanctions against Russia, and some of those sanctions were in place against Russian oil, such as the oil price cap, Rosneft was actually unaffected in terms of direct sanctions. You could still legitimately deal with Rosneft if you wanted to. If your country wasn't actually sanctioning Russia across the board, such as India, they didn't do that. They were able to deal with Rosneft and buy huge volumes of oil. And the reason why India was doing that was because Rosneft was offering a very good deal. It was the best price in the market, and India decided that it was right for the Indian economy to start buying millions of barrels of oil every single day. However, what we're seeing in the first 9 months is that the cumulative impact of the sanctions, which have started to get tighter and tighter, there has been a threat of secondary sanctions handing over India and China for the past 12 to 18 months. They've been told that if they're found to be dealing with any entities that have been sanctioned in Russia, then they will face sanctions themselves and lose all of their export markets. So we started to see some of the businesses pulling back from dealing with Rosneft. And that's why we've seen revenue falling in the first 9 months of the year. But interestingly, profitability has fallen disproportionately more. And the reason for that is because Rosneft is a very high fixed business. So when your revenue goes down, your costs don't go down at the same rate. You still have to pay all your people, you still have to pay your depreciation and amortization, you still have to pay the interest on your loans, you still have to pay your taxes. So all of that has stayed at a high level while revenue has come down, which has meant that profitability is starting to crash. But the problem that Rosneft is now facing is twofold. Firstly, it's got direct sanctions against it. So even Indian and Chinese and Turkish businesses are now pulling back from buying that oil. And we talked recently about the fact that Iraq had even started pushing back on buying Russian oil because it didn't want to face sanctions. But at the same time, global oil prices have also drifted down over the past 12 months because the production of oil is rising at a faster rate than the demand for oil. So that's why we're seeing prices starting to drift. So that's going to impact negatively on all businesses that produce oil. But Rosneft is obviously being hit much harder because it's got the double whammy of direct sanctions and a falling oil price. So all of this is disastrous news for Rosneft, which is very likely to report a massive loss by the end of 2025. And when you look forward to 2026, things are getting significantly worse, and none of those fixed costs are going away. So Rosneft is now going to become a drain on the state. One of the issues when you're a state-owned enterprise is that if you make losses, then somebody has to pick up the tab for those losses, and that's going to be the Russian economy. And the other problem that the Russian economy is facing is that it's been getting lots of tax payments from Rosneft. As it's been reporting all of those massive profits, it's paid a big chunk of tax. But that's not going to happen going forward. And all of the people that are employed by Rosneft are now at risk because if Rosneft does have to cut back on its production because it doesn't have anywhere to store oil, if it's pulling millions of barrels of oil out of the ground a day and it can't actually export them, then it's going to have to stop doing that. That potentially means that it could make lots of people redundant or put them on furlough or just not pay them. And either way, that will have a huge negative multiplier effect in all of the economies where those people live. So all of this represents serious bad news for the Russian economy through the rest of 2025 and going into 2026. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, found it useful, informative, and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you so much to everyone that supported me. If you bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member or a buy me a coffee member, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.